John Hammond, ATA President. We're delighted to have you. We had a good session the other day, and now we know we're in for a treat because Jean always gives us a wonderful program. I'll turn this over to Eric, our host today, to introduce Jean. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Our presenter today is Jean Wang. Jean has been a member of Canada Post's Stamp Advisory Committee since 2018. She is going to provide us with a behind-the-scenes look at the 2020 Canadian Medical Groundbreakers stamp issue, from initial proposal to launch. Jean Wang is a hematologist and leukemia researcher in Toronto with an interest in medical philately. She developed her thematic exhibit about the history of blood and transfusion medicine from a 2-frame national silver in 2015 to a 5-frame grand winner at CanPEX in 2019. She's written a number of articles on different aspects of medical philately for the Canadian Philatelist and Topical Time. Her current active collecting interest is COVID-19 related philately, which I want to see what she does with. Jean is the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada's delegate to the FIP Thematic Commission and was recently elected to the board of directors of the Vincent Graves Green Philatelic Research Foundation. So I would like to introduce Jean Wang to everybody.
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much, Eric, for that kind introduction. So is everybody able to see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is the Medical Groundbreakers stamp issue. So this was an issue that came out from Canada Post in September of 2020. So these are the 5 stamps in the set. And I was quite involved with this stamp issue. So actually, when I joined the Stamp Advisory Committee, I was the one that proposed this issue to Canada Post. So I was involved right from the beginning, from the proposal through the design process and all the way to the stamp launch. So I'm going to give you some insight into how this issue came about and the design process, so you can get kind of an idea of what goes on behind the scenes leading up to a stamp issue. And that process normally takes about 2 years. So these are the stamps, and we'll come back to the designs of the individual stamps later on. So just to give you a little bit of background about the Stamp Advisory Committee. So I know in the US you have a Stamp Advisory Committee. In Canada, we have a citizens, it's not called the Citizen Stamp Advisory Committee, it's just the Stamp Advisory Committee, but I think the makeup is very similar and the concept is very similar to the US one. So it officially can have at 12 people. I think currently there's 10 or 11 of us right now. And it's usually made up of designers. A lot of people on the committee actually have previously been designers of Canadian stamp issues, as well as historians. And usually there's 1 or 2 people who have a philatelic background. And so altogether, there's between 10 and 12 people. And this committee basically comes up with the stamp program for Canada Post. So there are some set issues, like every year, you know, we have the holiday Christmas issue, and we've got a flowers issue that comes out in the spring, and the definitive stamps whenever there's a rate change. But most of the commemorative issues that come out through the year, those are selected or approved by the Stamp Advisory Committee. And usually if there's anniversaries or, you know, significant milestones coming up, people have to start thinking about proposing a stamp issue for it about 2 years ahead of time, because the whole process from accepting, you know, discussing the proposal, accepting it, getting the design done, and then the whole printing process does take about 2 years. So you have to think ahead of time. So I first learned about the Stamp Advisory Committee at a local stamp show in Toronto in 2017, because Jim Phillips, who he just recently retired, but he was the head of the stamp services for many years. And he came and he gave a talk about the Stamp Advisory Committee and explained how it all worked and showed us some previous or recent issues at that time and some of the sort of not accepted designs. And so it was really cool. And I thought, how cool would that be? And then about a year later, I actually was invited to join the Stamp Advisory Committee. So I just jumped at it. I thought, like, I think any philatelist would jump at the opportunity to be intimately involved in the stamp design and issue process. So I joined them. So that was in March of 2018. And so just to kind of give you a background of where the Stamp Advisory Committee is involved. So this is the whole stamp process from the idea out to the stamp launch, and then, Canada Post does their own sort of fiscal management of the stamp issue. But basically, in terms of the ideas, Canada Post accepts stamp proposals for stamp issues from anybody. So anybody in the public can propose a stamp issue. Some of the ideas for stamp issues come from the committee itself, from Stamp Services or from the advisory committee. Some organizations, if they have milestones or anniversaries coming up, they'll submit requests to Canada, to the advisory committee. So at every meeting, we go over all the ideas and we discuss them and we decide which ones we're going to keep. I mean, there's limited room in the stamp program, unfortunately, so we can't accept everything. And we have to consider, balance across the country and in terms of being inclusive for different cultures and, try and get balance, if not within a single issue, but at least balance over the whole stamp program. And so that's what happens at SAC. We meet 3 times a year, usually in February, in June, and then either September or October. We had been meeting in person up till the pandemic, but the last couple of years, unfortunately, we've been meeting online, which is, it's never as nice as meeting in person. And when we were meeting, we met in Ottawa and the meetings were full day, but online, because people are from both ends of the country, our meetings are quite short because of the time zone differences. But once we accept an idea, the Stamp Services commission usually 2 or 3 design firms to come up with design concepts for the stamp issue. And then each, individual or firm will come up with usually 2 or 3 designs. And so those will come back to the committee and they present all the different design concepts. Usually there's anywhere between 6 to 10 design concepts, and they, somebody from the committee presents all the different design concepts to the advisory committee, and we discuss it. And we usually, it's usually pretty obvious after a little bit of discussion which one we're going to go for. Sometimes there's 2 that are, closely tied in terms of what people like. And so sometimes the chair has to make like a tie-breaking vote, but usually it's, pretty obvious which one is our favorite. And then sometimes we ask for, especially the designers, they'll suggest slight changes and that'll go back. And so then that goes back to the design manager and they liaise with the designer and they go back and forth and finalize the design. And then they decide on what configurations, whether it's going to be a booklet, if there's going to be a souvenir sheet, etc. And then they do all the planning for the launch. And when we were doing stuff in person, sometimes for the big stamp issues, they would have like an in-person launch at the location that was sort of relevant to whatever was being commemorated on the stamp. So for example, we recently had stamps commemorating Blue Nose, which is a really significant schooner in Canadian history, and that was done in Halifax. They pick a spot that's significant. We've been doing, or they've been doing a lot of virtual stamp launches during the pandemic. So where the advisory committee is involved is usually, picking the concepts and then in the design part. And we're not typically involved in the configurations and planning for stamp launch and things like that. That's just done internally at Canada Post. So, when I joined the committee, so that was in March of 2018, I was very excited. And I told everybody at work, so my day job is I'm a hematologist and I do research in leukemia. And I focus on leukemia stem cells. And so a lot of my work and, my original thesis work is around blood cancer or blood stem cells and blood cancer stem cells. And so I was very excited and I told everybody at work that I was on the committee, and Dr. Norman Iskov, who's one of the sort of senior scientists there, and he has been working in the field of blood stem cells for a long time. And the 2 scientists who sort of started off the stem cell field are James Till and Ernest McCullough. And they did their work in Toronto at the Ontario Cancer Institute. It's not called Ontario Cancer Institute anymore, but it's basically the same institution where I work. And they're icons, right? They're basically considered the fathers of stem cell science. And so immediately he said, "Oh, why don't you see if you can get Till and McCullough on a stamp?" So I thought, wow, that's a great idea. I mean, you know, I was already starting to think of how I could, bring some of my background expertise to the committee and propose some stamp issues maybe that were related to medicine or to science. And so I thought this was a good idea. So first of all, some of you might wonder whether living people can be on stamps. So Canada Post had this policy previously that you could not be on a stamp if you were a living person, except for the Queen, of course. But they changed that in 2005. And so the first person who benefited from that rule change was Oscar Peterson. So he had a stamp issued while he was still alive. And I think Canada Post changed their policy because they thought it would be nice, you know, for people, if they were going to be honored for, you know, their body of work or their achievements, that it would be nice for them to have that honor and recognition while they were still alive. And in fact, you know, I've heard a lot of stories from different people on the stamp or on, you know, Canada Post stamp services that when they've done this for living people, that they have felt like it's been amazing for them. You know, it's like the biggest honor because it's like you're on a stamp and it's, you know, you're part of Canadian history now, and it's out there for everybody to see. You know, and they say it's like the best honor, even bigger than other things that they've gotten through their career. So it is possible. And even though Dr. McCullough has passed away, Dr. Till is still alive. So that was okay. But then I thought, you know, so here's, you know, Dr. Till and Dr. McCullough, just to give you a bit of background. So, you know, they are considered the fathers of the stem cell science field, as I mentioned. They published their original experiments back in the 1960s, where they really demonstrated the existence of blood stem cells, and they did significant experiments using mouse bone marrow to show, you know, to develop methods to actually test for them and detect stem cells and be able to do manipulations and study them. So they really, you know, kicked the field off. And there's actually, this is the building where I work. It's called the Mars Building in Toronto. And there's actually a bronze sculpture installation just outside one of the entrances. This is Dr. Till and Dr. McCullough sitting on stools, and you can actually go, there's a couple of stools that you can go and sit on, you know, just to have like a chat about science. So you know, they're very significant in our field. But then I thought, you know, they're very significant for us, but maybe it's too narrow for a stamp issue for Canada Post. But I kind of had, you know, I knew from other discussions that even when one person may not necessarily merit their own stamp issue, if you, you know, propose a sort of broader issue that includes them, but includes other people, and it's sort of maybe a 4 or 5 stamp issue, that would have more of a chance of being accepted at Canada Post because it tells a broader story. You know, it's more representative across Canada, and et cetera. So I put on my thinking cap and I went, I looked into the, excuse me, into the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame, and also looked at the Order of Canada. Excuse me, because even though they accept living people on stamps, they still have to be, you know, I think that, you know, they obviously have to have a significant body of work, but having something like the Order of Canada means they've been vetted as well and, you know, gone through this sort of rigorous process, because the last thing you want to do is put somebody on a stamp who's still living, and then later on they might do something that's maybe a little embarrassing, right? And that has happened. I won't mention any names, but so I went to look, and I came up with what I thought would be a nice rounded out proposal for Canada Post. So here's the people that I proposed for this stamp issue. So the first, we'll just go from west to east. So Dr. Julio Montaner is actually originally from Argentina. So he's a respirologist. Came up to Vancouver to do his residency many years ago and ended up marrying a Canadian and staying in Canada. and did a lot of work on AIDS research into the treatment of HIV and AIDS. And basically through his work, developing multi-drug treatments and running the clinical trials, he converted AIDS from what was then a fatal disease. So when I was doing my internship in the 1980s, young men were dying like horrible deaths from AIDS. And he came up with this treatment, led the clinical trials, and basically has converted AIDS into a chronic disease that's completely manageable by medications, and people just take these drugs and they're completely, they lead a normal life. And it's also, suppressed transmission. So it's like really significantly changed the complexion of that disease. And then Dr. Bruce Chown, who was a hematopathologist, he's passed away now, but he was a hematopathologist in Winnipeg, and he did research into something called rhesus disease, or hemolytic disease with a newborn, which was a disease that affected, a disorder that affected newborns when the mother and father had a blood type incompatibility. So rhesus blood group incompatibility could result in significant problems for the babies. And, it was a really terrible thing. It was like, babies that had this, it was about 50% mortality, and it accounted for like 10% of infant deaths in that period when we didn't really understand what it was. So he did research to understand the basis for it. And then a treatment was developed, and he led the clinical trials that led to approval. He actually, there was a lab in Winnipeg, and there's, he led the Canadian trials that basically led to approval of a treatment that could actually, it's not a treatment, it's an injection that prevents hemolytic disease from developing. And so pregnant women, if they're Rh negative, they just get a couple of injections once during pregnancy, once right after delivery, and that basically prevents the disease. So in one generation, it went from a terrible disease that killed lots of babies to something that's just simply preventable by injections. So that was really significant for that, population, for that patient population. And then Vera Peters, who was a radiation oncologist, worked in Toronto. And she, in the 1930s and 1940s, did a lot of work on understanding the basis for Hodgkin lymphoma, which is a type of lymphoma. It often affects younger people, and it was considered a fatal disease. And she demonstrated actually that with local radiation, you could actually cure the disease. And so she converted, people from young people that were dying to it basically being cured. And then afterwards, she also did some work in breast cancer, showing that women who had early stage breast cancer, instead of getting like a radical mastectomy, which was quite disfiguring, that if they just did a lumpectomy and some radiation, that was just as effective. And so that was really important for, women's health at that time. And she did all that work in a period when women scientists were not necessarily respected, because it was a very male dominated field at that time. And then Tilla McCullough, who I've already talked to you about, also from Toronto. And then Balfour Mount, who was he was actually a cancer surgeon who was in Montreal, and he saw that people with cancer at the end of life were suffering terribly with pain, and there wasn't really an understanding of how to treat them and treat their pain. And so he actually founded the field of palliative medicine, which is basically focused on improving the quality of life at the end of life. So for patients with cancer and other terminal illnesses, to improve their quality of life. And he brought back, he went to England and saw what was happening in the hospices there, and brought those principles back to Canada, and basically founded this whole discipline of palliative care medicine. And he's considered the father of palliative care in North America. So I thought, these 5 people from across Canada that worked in different areas of medicine and medical research, and affecting many different, a broad segment of the population, from newborns to people at the end of life, regenerative medicine, stem cell medicine. So it was just a nice, cohesive issue, I thought. And so we discussed it at my first STAMP Advisory Committee meeting, and they accepted it. They thought it was great. And so then the STAMP committee took it to their stamp designers, and they commissioned 2 or 3 stamp firms. And at the next meeting in September, those designs were then brought back to the STAMP Advisory Committee, and So what happens is the design manager presents all the designs to the committee one by one, and then we discuss them and vote on them. So typically with a 5 stamp issue, they don't, when the designers are doing the concepts, they don't do the concepts for all of the stamps, because that's a lot of work. They usually pick 2 representative stamps and do the concepts for that. And once the final design concept is picked, then they'll go back and do the designs for the other 3 stamps. So they focused on the 2 stamps that they focused on out of the 5 stamp set were actually the stamp for Vera Peters and the stamp for Tilla McCullough. And they chose those because Vera Peters was the only woman in the set, and Tilla McCullough was the only stamp that would have 2 people in the set. So they just wanted to make sure the design was going to work for those 2. And so these are the 5 different concepts. So in this case, we didn't have a lot of concepts. And the designers, you know, they didn't have any medical or scientific background. This is really just, you know, design concept. And so and, you know, they don't ever tell us who the designers are or how many design firms are involved. I suspect that this might have been only from 2 designers, but I'm not sure, actually don't even know. So these are the different designs. So you can see they're quite different. And, you know, the designers, they kind of choose the layout, whether it's going to be horizontal or vertical, and what shape the stamp is going to be. So we don't really have any control over that. But we discussed, and you can see like some of them are drawings, some of them are photos. And so this is typical of the variety of designs that we get to choose from for the stamp issue. So ultimately, and you know, you probably have your favorites just by looking at these, but ultimately, this is the concept that we liked the best out of all of them. And I have to say that, you know, just kind of thinking back to that discussion at that meeting, I think I preferred this one, but you know, most of the committee actually preferred this design. So we take a vote, and even though it was my proposal, you know, I don't get any more of a vote than anybody else. And so the majority votes were for this design. Although we did have some suggestions. So for example, you know, these lines, the line drawings sort of radiating out of the patient's head, I didn't really like that. I mean, I didn't kind of like the visual of that. And so we suggested that they make some changes to these sort of background line drawings. And also, you know, they had put medical heroes on each stamp. So the initial title for the series was Medical Heroes. And we thought, you know, that really wasn't necessary. And what we should do instead is put some text about what each person's contribution was, you know, their name and their contribution. So, you know, we made a few suggestions, and we sent those back to the designers. And what typically happens is they'll work with the design manager. And if it's just minor things, they usually don't come back to the committee. But in this case, I think we wanted some fairly substantial changes. So they did come back then later on with some new concepts that they had reworked based on the feedback they got. And so these were presented. I can't remember now if this was sort of presented just outside one of our regular meetings, but Canada Post gave me these slides. So these were the follow-up design concepts from the designer that, you know, whose design we had picked. And so you can see they changed sort of some of the background illustrations. This is, you know, and now they've gone and done the design for the whole set, right? Because now okay, this is the design we've chosen. Now let's design the whole set. So these are the designs so this is the first new option that we got. And you can see they've added a little Order of Canada ribbon there. And they've got the different illustrations that kind of illustrate what the different contributions were. And you can see that now it says like Hodgkin's disease here, palliative care, stem cells. So now they describe what the different contributions are. So this is one set. This is another set, which is basically the same except for like different background. And actually we didn't like this one very much because there was really no contrast. Like you can see from the first one, there's definitely more contrast and you can see the illustrations better. But with this one, it was kind of all washed out. Then there was this one, which was, you know, instead of drawings, they actually used photo images in the background. So they would have like a background that was colored and then an object that was related to whatever they did, and then a black and white photo of the person. And this is the last one. So similar kind of idea with the background, and instead of an object, just these line drawings as they had before. So So here's the pair of stamps from, you know, the first concepts, and here's I've just pulled out the two from the new design offerings that they brought back to us. And so out of these four, after some discussion back and forth, we ended up picking this design here. So this was the, you know, we liked the colors, we liked the black and white photos, and we thought it was kind of cool to have, you know, a background and then some object that was related. So so this was the concept that we picked for the whole set. So after this point, now you get into the nitty gritty of the design, and usually, you know, SAC is not involved very much with this. You know, it's usually the design manager going back and forth with the designers. But because the designers, you know, didn't have medical and scientific background, and you know, I was the one that had proposed it, and I have a medical and scientific background, the designers or the design manager rather came back to me back and forth quite a lot with updates on the designs and asking me for input and whether, you know, the images were correct. Like Canada Post, I would say, takes a lot of care in their research to make sure that they get the right images. You know, there's always mistakes that are made and things that fall through the cracks, but they you know, they do very you know, they do a lot of due diligence in their research and in making sure the images and stuff that they select are correct. And so they sent me the you know, so this is the sort of initial concepts, and this page has, you know, so it's provided by the designer, and it basically has the image, the source of where they got all the images, including the background image, you know, any foreground images. And so I went through, so the design manager sent this to me, and I went through each image to make sure that it was correct or appropriate. So I'll just go through them one by one. So this stamp, actually, I'll just start with because it had the least amount of change, and I didn't really have any input to this one. I mean, it was, you know, it's palliative care, it's end of life care, quality of life. And so you know, I thought the design was fine, and they didn't, you know, I didn't have any input for this one. This is a nice photo of Dr. Mount. He himself had cancer too. So he had two different types of cancer. So he went, you know, he's seen this side of cancer from, you know, both a physician and being a patient. So this was the original concept. And this ended up being the final stamp design. So you can see the only thing that they did was they flipped the foreground image here of the hands. But the background image is the same. And you can see other small changes as well. Like they made some small changes in the font from the beginning to the end. They bolded his name to provide some contrast. They changed the ribbon on the Order of Canada. You know, so just minor things. And like I said, these things are usually not something that SAC is involved with. So for Dr. Chowns, remember, this is the hemolytic disease. So the thing that happens in hemolytic disease is the mother is typically Rh negative and the father is Rh positive. And the thing that causes problems is the Rh positive. So if the fetus is Rh positive, some of those red blood cells escape into the mother's circulation across the placenta or during delivery, and they trigger an immune response in the mother. She makes antibodies against the Rh positive red blood cells, and then that can affect subsequent pregnancies. If the babies are Rh positive, those antibodies cross the placenta and they can damage the baby's red blood cells and cause significant problems for the baby. So they've illustrated that here. These are just red blood cells, and the designers put these positive and negative signs on the red blood cells to represent the rhesus blood group, so Rh positive versus Rh negative. But the one thing that I noticed was that, you know, so the Rh positive cells from the baby that get into the mother circulation are quite rare. They're not very common, but, you know, here, if you actually count them, there's more plus signs than minus signs. So although this is a really minor point, I just thought for correctness, I asked them if they could, you know, just maybe have one plus sign and all the rest should be negative, because the mother's red blood cells are negative and it's just the rare, you know, positive cell from the baby. So they changed that on my suggestion. So you can see these are all positive signs here. And so in the final design, they only left this one positive one and changed all the rest to negative. And you can see also they, you know, and this was nothing to do with me. They didn't like this baby, I guess, and they found another baby that was lying on his stomach instead of being held on his back. So, so that was Dr. Chown's stamp. The one red blood cell. This one, so Dr. Montiner, so this was a photo, I think, that was already pre-existing, and I didn't point out earlier, but you'll see all of the stamps when I show the whole set later, all of the stamps have in the photos of the individuals, you can see their hands, and they liked that because it was kind of like, tying in caring and that sort of human touch. And so they found this photo of Dr. Montaner. I didn't, in the original meeting, I said, I don't really like the perspective of this photo. Like his hand looks very strange, kind of like a claw there, just from the perspective of the photo. And then Dr. Montaner himself didn't like having the drugs there. So these represent the multi-drug treatment of HIV. And he asked them to change that to a pink ribbon. So, when people are living, they often will go get feedback from the person themselves too, when they're doing the stamp design, to make sure that the person being commemorated on the stamp is happy with the stamp design. And then the other thing was this background, which, if you look at it now, at that time, of course, we didn't think about this, but, if you look at it now, it actually even looks like a coronavirus, right? Like it's got these spikes on the surface. I think they were just looking for something that represented, either a pathogen or an infected cell. I don't even know what they were thinking, but this is the stock photo. And I knew that because I had that sort of cheat sheet with all the links to where they got their sources. Where their sources were of all the images. And so what I did was I went online and I searched for an image of a T, so HIV infects T cells. It's a kind of immune cell. And so I found this really nice scanning electron micrograph. So it's just a 3D, high resolution image of a T cell. And all these red dots represent the HIV virus. So it's a really nice image of a T cell that's infected with HIV viruses. And it's actually like an image of an infected cell. So I thought that would be more appropriate than these sort of, stock, whatever they are, virus or 3D cell. So they substituted that. So this is the final stamp now. So they took away the drugs, they put the red ribbon, I think I said pink ribbon. Pink ribbon is breast cancer, so red ribbon is AIDS. And they removed these background cells and substituted the infected T cells. And then they couldn't find another photo that they thought was suitable. So they actually, the designers were actually in Vancouver, and Dr. Montaner works in Vancouver. So they actually went and had a photo shoot with him to reshoot the photo in sort of a similar pose, but, much better perspective. So this is the final stamp design here. And you can see also they changed HIV therapy to include HIV AIDS treatment and prevention. And that was probably from feedback from Dr. Montaner himself. Okay, so then, so now these two stamps are sort of more near and dear to my heart, because both of these stamps are, represent people that were worked in Toronto at the Cancer Institute where I work now. And Vera Peters worked at a time sort of in the 30s and 40s. She did a lot of work. She was known for being a real like patient person. Like she would talk to her patients and get their opinion. And that wasn't the kind of thing that doctors did back then. They were very, you do what your doctor says, right? So, but she was very much somebody who would, talk to her patients and find out what their wishes were and things like that. So, so her family, so she's passed away, but her family was very involved in the whole stamp design process. And they, she was a very good teacher and a mentor too. So they actually wanted an image of her, when she was teaching or mentoring. And so rather than this photo, they ended up picking a photo where she is standing and doing some instruction, some teaching. And they also changed, I guess, they didn't want this person there. So they changed this foreground image of a radiation machine to some other stock photo. And then the background image was just some generic histology. And so when I went and looked at what each of these images were, there were quite a few things I gave them feedback on. So first of all, I didn't understand. So if you look here, so when you look at the image here, I didn't really understand what this was because you only see a small slice of it. And then there was this thing here, which I couldn't kind of make out what it was. And then I went online and I actually found the original photo that this was based on. So and then I understood what it was. So she's standing here, she's giving a lecture and she's pointing to a, large poster of the human body. And she's indicating what she's probably talking about here, she's got her hand at the level of sort of the diaphragm, because in Hodgkin's disease, when you stage it, you talk about disease above the diaphragm and disease below the diaphragm. And so she's got her hand here, you know, indicating where that anatomical position is. But what they did in the stamp design was they kind of, you know, they separated this and they moved it down a bit, I guess, to kind of give, you know, when you're a designer, there's all kinds of things that you think about too in terms of positioning and layout. And so I guess they didn't want the poster all the way to the top of the stamp. And so they moved it down. But when they did that, you know, they kind of cut her hand off here. And so you kind of see this duplicated hand. So it looked just really weird. So I pointed that out to them that they had to fix that. The second thing was this background image was just some generic image of breast cancer, but her first and most significant work, and what she's sort of first known for, is the work that she did in Hodgkin's disease. So I thought it would be more appropriate to have something representative of Hodgkin's rather than breast cancer. And then the third thing was that this radiation machine is a very modern radiation machine, you know, so they just went online and they found a generic photo. But I thought, you know, because she worked in the 30s and 40s, and actually at the Cancer Institute, there were other people that were working to develop radiation machines to treat cancer patients. And there was stuff that was actually, you know, technology that was actually developed in Toronto, and that's previously been commemorated on a stamp as well. There was a cobalt irradiator, basically. So I thought it would be much more appropriate to actually show the kind of machine that she would have used herself at that time, rather than a modern machine. And so they agreed with all of these comments. And so this is actually a photo that you can find on the U of T website. This is Vera Peters, and this is the machine that she would have used. So it's called a cobalt exotron. So this was developed at Ontario Cancer Institute. And then I went on a pathology website and I actually found, you know, because you can find images of Hodgkin lymphoma everywhere. And, you know, the thing that I still remember from medical school, so I don't work with Hodgkin lymphoma or Hodgkin's disease. But what I do remember from medical school is there's a very typical characteristic that you can see on the pathology, and these are called Reed-Sternberg cells. So these are sort of doublet cells, and they look like owl eyes. And so these are the cells here. You can see they kind of look like owl eyes, and that's all I remember about Hodgkin's pathology from medical school. But like, I remembered it, right? So I thought it would be really nice to have a pathology background that showed Hodgkin's disease with these Reed-Sternberg cells. The vast majority of people looking at the stamp wouldn't care and wouldn't really, you know, understand it. But, you know, you're going to get the occasional person who has a medical background, who works in Hodgkin, who will find them on the stamp. And that's kind of cool, right? It's like an Easter egg. So this was from a website called webpathology.com. It was developed by a pathologist in the US as a learning tool. And he just he does it kind of free in his spare time. He uploads images of different diseases for people to study. And so I emailed him and with Canada Post permission, and asked him if it would be okay for us to use the image on his stamp. You know, the Canada Post doesn't pay for images, but they acknowledge. And so he's, you know, I think his reaction is probably typical of what a lot of people's reactions would be. He thought it was really cool and thought, sure, you know, go ahead. Like, how cool would it be to have one of my images on a stamp, right? So he said for sure that would be fine. So that was that. And then, so this is the final stamp now. So what they did was they corrected the position of this poster. They substituted the image of the, you know, contemporaneous machine that Vera Peters would have used. And they put in the background the Hodgkin lymphoma pathology. So they broke it up a little bit, but you can see the Reed-Sternberg cells poking out here and here. And actually, I'm vindicated because the editor of Scalpel and Tongs, who's, you know, Fred Scavara, who does the newsletter Scalpel and Tongs for the medical subjects unit, he saw the Reed-Sternberg cells. So, you know, and like, that to me is just the coolest, right? Like, if I looked at it and found it, it's just like, it's, you know, we're kind of dweeby. I think we like stuff like this, right? So, okay. And then this, of course, was the stamp that kicked the whole thing off. And the reason why I wanted to propose the stamp issue in the first place was I thought, you know, it would be great to have Tilla McCullough on a stamp. So this was the original concept that the designers came up with. And so when I looked at the, so the background is just a couple of cells dividing, which I thought was fine, because there's actually no way that you can, there's no image of stem cells per se that you can say these are stem cells. So I thought, having a couple of cells dividing representing stem cells is perfectly fine. And they had these black and white photos of Till and McCullough. And then they used this to represent the bone marrow, because their original experiments involved mouse bone marrow, so radiating mice and then taking bone marrow and doing transplantations of the bone marrow cells. But I looked at this and I couldn't really figure out what the heck that picture was. And so when I looked at the source information, I realized it was from a website that talked about hip osteoarthritis. And they had found this image. And what they actually had done was they had flipped the image and then rotated it. And when I pointed this out to the Canada Post person on the Stamp Services Committee, she said, oh, they're actually not supposed to modify pictures. Like when they take pictures, they're supposed to just use them as is rather than using mirror images. But she actually had gotten feedback from Dr. Till as well, who had suggested, because they did their experiments in mouse bone marrow, really nice to show mouse bone marrow rather than human bone marrow. So I thought about that a bit, and how could you find an image where people would sort of see that it was bone marrow, right? With like, I didn't really sort of like this picture. And could we find one that was actually mouse bones or mouse bone marrow? So I actually went back and asked Dr. Isco, because he does a lot of work in mouse bone marrow. I sort of looked through our lab stuff for histology and stains and things like that. And we have a lot of more zoomed in close-ups of bone marrow cells, but there wasn't anything that sort of would be obvious to the layperson that this was like bone or bone marrow. So one of, I asked a bunch of people in the lab, and one of them actually pointed out to me this paper that was published by, it was written by Sean Morrison. It's actually a review paper published in 2017, where they had done some cool 3D imaging of mouse bones. And they had this one figure. So this is a mouse femur. It's kind of upside down. This is the hip joint here. And this is the knee joint. But they had, it's sort of sliced open, and they had the bone marrow stained red. So, it's a little bit more obvious that this is actually a bone with bone marrow, right? So I sent this image and I sent the paper to the design manager. She sent it to the designers, and they played around with it a little bit, and they mocked up, they kind of moved the images around, and they came up with this instead of this. And I thought that would be terrific. And the design manager was really happy with how this looked. But this was from a journal paper, and I wasn't sure that we could use it because of copyright and things like that. So I actually emailed Sean Morrison. He's in the US now. He's a scientist, but he's actually Canadian, so he's working in the US. And so I emailed him that we have a stamp issue coming out. I can't tell you what it's all about, but could you give us an image that's similar to the one from this paper? And so he and Elise Jeffrey, who's one of his postdocs, sent us this image. And so I sent that to Canada Post, and that's what they ultimately used on the stamp design. So they, again, manipulated it a little bit and just used the top part of the image. And, I hope that's obvious, or maybe not obvious to everybody, but at least it looks like bones, and, with the bone marrow in the middle. So I think anybody that sort of eats chicken bones and stuff, you can kind of tell what that is. And so this is the final stamp design. Actually, I lie. It's not the final stamp design. It's pretty close to the final. The other thing I noticed at this point was that they had Dr. McCullough's name first and then Dr. Till. And the reason they did that was because Dr. McCullough is shown first on the stamp, and then Dr. Till is to his right. So, left to right, it's McCullough and Till. And when I looked at the mock-up of the first day cover right up, so this is on the back of the first day cover, they also had McCullough and Till. And, I told them, everybody in the scientific community refers to them as Till and McCullough. There's like a Till and McCullough award. There's a Till and McCullough lecture series. It's like Simon and Garfunkel. It would sound weird to say Garfunkel and Simon, right? So to me, it sounds really weird to say McCullough and Till. And, if you're in the know and you know who they are, you're going to look at that image and you'll know who McCullough and who Till is. It doesn't matter about the order. And if you don't know, you'll just read the blurb, right? So I thought for people, who are in the field, it was actually more important to have, like Till and McCullough. I know these are like small details, but I think as stamp collectors, we are detail oriented, and certainly the stamp committee didn't mind me going back and forth with them with all these details. And, they ultimately want to get it right as well. So they did change it. So this is now the final stamp design. So James Till and Ernest McCullough, and they changed the order Till and McCullough on the write-up as well. So these are the final stamps. So you can see what I mentioned before, that you can see their hands in all of them, right? And I think that's kind of nice, actually, that it's that human touch of all the people on the stamp, on the stamps. And so these stamps were issued in booklet form. So Canada Post typically issues all their stamps now as self-adhesive stamps in booklets. And sometimes they'll have a souvenir sheet as well, which is gummed, but almost all of the modern stamps are only issued in booklets now. And so they, also went, and typically it's SAC, like the Stamp Advisory Committee is not involved in any of this, like the first day cover design, in the postmark design, in the booklet cover design. But because they, they had been going back and forth with me about the stamp designs, they also asked me for advice and feedback about the booklet cover and et cetera. And so one of the things that they wanted to have on the booklet cover was a stethoscope. They had gone through a number of different designs, but they liked this sort of layout. But they couldn't find any images online that didn't have this logo. So this is a Littmann stethoscope. So that's the manufacturer of the stethoscope, but they didn't want to have the Littmann logo on the stamp booklet. And so the designers kind of tried to fudge it out, just I guess in their Photoshop or whatever, but it didn't really look right. I mean, this is what the stethoscope looks. This is actually my stethoscope. I sent them a picture of this. This black ring is a rubber ring around the one side of the stethoscope. It's called the bell. So that, the pictures here didn't look exactly right. So what they ended up doing, I actually, as I mentioned, the designers were in Vancouver. So I actually emailed a friend of mine in Vancouver who scrounged up a new Littmann cardiology stethoscope and actually couriered it over to the design firm. They did some photography on it and then sent it back to him. So this is actually a photograph of a cardiology stethoscope that my friend sent them. This coat hanger there is just to kind of keep it in position for the photography. And then this is the final. So this was like a mock-up, and this is the final design cover. So you can see they changed the name from Medical Heroes to Medical Groundbreakers. And all the people are listed here with Till and McCullough in the right order. And this is the inside of the booklet. So it's laid out in 2 panes, so 2 sets of 5 stamps. And on the back of the booklet, like I mentioned, Canada Post doesn't pay for any images or anything, but they do put all the acknowledgements. And so they, you don't see Sean Morrison here, but I think somewhere on here or on the back, maybe, I probably didn't enlarge it here, but Sean Morrison is acknowledged for the image of the bone marrow. And I got my name on here too. So this is the only time I'm sure that I'm ever going to be on a stamp or a stamp product. So, and Dr. Iskov, as I mentioned, he also helped with some of the write-up on the stem cell stuff. And Dr. Gospodarowicz was helping them a lot with Dr. Vera Peters' stamp. So these, so when they did the stamp launch, so unfortunately at that time we were sort of on lockdown, so they weren't able to do a live stamp launch, which I was really disappointed because I thought, for sure they would have done the launch in Toronto because 2 of the people in the set were from Toronto, but they ended up doing a virtual stamp launch. I was actually involved in a lot of the videos. They had me interviewing some of the people for the different videos. And they actually came into my backyard and videotaped me introducing the whole stamp set for the main video. So if you actually, I'll give you the link to the website later, but if you actually go to the website, there's individual videos for each stamp. And then there's one video at the top for all of the issues. And I'm actually introducing that video. But they did have, a little bit of press around it, and they made these stamp enlargements for Princess Margaret, which is now what the Ontario Cancer Institute is called. And they had these up in their lobby for a couple of weeks. And I asked them, once they were done with them, could I steal them? And if you can see them behind me here. They've been in my stamp den for probably a year and a half now. But eventually, when we get back to working in person. I'm going to bring them into work and we'll put them up in our conference room. So that's kind of cool. They're like 2 feet by 3 feet poster board. And I was able to, you know, I sent first day covers to Dr. Mount and Dr. Montaigne and Dr. Till and had them autograph, you know, so this is like the fangirl in me. So I had them autograph them for me. So I was able to get those nice souvenirs. And if you're interested, I've written an article that gives a bit more background about the contributions of each of these people for the Canadian Philatelist. So anybody that would like a PDF of the article, just, you know, you can message me and I'll be happy to send you the PDF. And this is the link. So I just made a bit.ly link. So if you go to this link here, that's takes you to this page on Canada Post. So this is the main video here, but if you scroll down, you'll be able to see individual videos for all of the, that in the individual videos give you a little bit more background on each individual's contribution. And they have interviews with the person if they're living and their family if they're passed away. And I thought, if you'll indulge me, this is a very short video. I thought I would just play you the video for Dr. Till and McCullough because it's, you know, Canada Post does a really nice job, I think, of with their videos for all their stamp launches and how they commemorate them. So I'll just play this.
Dr. James Till, an expert in biophysics, and Dr. Ernest McCullough, a specialist in hematology, proved to be a powerful team. They refined the definition of stem cells and established an entirely new field of medicine to treat such serious conditions as blindness, paralysis, and cancer.
The head of the physics group asked for a volunteer to work with Dr. McCullough, and I volunteered. We found we enjoyed working with each other, and we became genuine colleagues who participated equally in the designing of experiments. Well, of course, we didn't know at the time we were creating a new field.
I think that Till and McCullough, their work beginning in the 1960s, really set stem cell research on a different stage. They really gave birth to the modern era of stem cell research.
We complemented each other. Our backgrounds were so different that we brought fresh perspectives that would not be available to either of us alone.
Jim was a physicist, right? He was trained in sort of hardcore quantitative details of how things, worked at the subatomic level. McCullough was the physician, and he was also a biologist. Biologists tend to have a little more flexible type of view on a problem, and so by bringing the two of them together, I think was the magical sauce, so to speak, that allowed this sort of creativity to happen.
This is a broader Canadian community acknowledging his contributions and his work. And I think that would have touched him because he wanted to do science, but he wanted to do it for people.
Sorry. So that's it. That's all I have to say. Thanks for listening. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that anybody has.